So welcome everyone to Be Revealed with Wendy Watson, where we talk about spirituality and the infinite number of ways that spirituality can be created for yourself and whatever that looks like for you. From my opinion, spirituality is all about your relationship with whatever source that you're in connection with. And so I created this show to provide people a safe space to talk about their spirituality. So I really ask for those that are attending or those that are going to watch the replay to really hold space for my guests, as it takes a lot of courage and strength to be able to talk about your spirituality on such a public place and online. So today I'm going to welcome Mr. Eric Goodman. If you'd like to take just a minute to introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. Dr. Eric Goodman, and I am a business strategist, I guess you could say. I'm a recovering academic, having earned my PhD at CU Boulder in business administration, and then spent many years in the corporate realm and then leading universities and various programs over a decade as a business school dean, but really passionate about helping people maximize and leverage their potential. And I think that's where it fits into spirituality. We'll, I'm sure, talk more about that,
Yes.
but really committed to helping people figure out their genius in life and what they're meant to be doing. So that's a little bit about my background.
Awesome. I love it. All right. So I always start the show off with one main question, which usually really gets the conversation started. How do you define spirituality for yourself?
You know, that's such a great question. For myself, in terms of how I define spirituality, I think it's really an intersection of knowing yourself and being true to yourself and what you're meant to be doing in this spiritual plane, if you will. And yes, there is, you mentioned sort of that source, that connectedness. Everyone may have something different that they experience, but it's that idea of going beyond yourself and a little bit of a self-transcendence, I think, is as I think about spirituality, because I think it goes beyond our ego in terms of the ability we have to impact others, and because we're all connected. And so I think about spirituality in that sense. And I think that ultimately it's about us having an awareness of that connection in terms of spirituality, that we are all connected and that, you know, what we do can make a big difference in the world. And I think it was Mark Twain, don't quote me, but I think, you know, so there's the two most important days in your life are the day you're born and the day you figure out why. And so I think there's that aspect of spiritual intelligence to understanding the why. What's the meaning in your life and the purpose? So
Awesome. I love that. So
thank you.
let's delve into, like, how were you raised? What kind of a household were you brought up in? And tell us a little bit about your spiritual journey.
Yeah, so, you know, I was raised in Judaism and very reform. I guess there's a spectrum of Judaism from reform to conservative to orthodox to ultra orthodox and so forth. And so I was raised in that religion, I guess you could say, and never really talked about spirituality directly, although there were inclinations of spirituality that were alluded to in Judaism. I heard about this thing called the Kabbalah as a kid, and I'm like, what is that? Like this book of Jewish mysticism and some of, you know, those ideas and concepts. And I can remember being in high school, I took a world religion course, which was really interesting because we got into, you know, understanding different types of religions and, you know, monotheistic beliefs and, you know, things that were in common between Christianity and Muslim, Islam, and, you know, different religions that looked at, you know, is there one God or are there multiple gods? Like, what does that, you know, amount to? And then I remember in high school, actually, I had a friend of mine who read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And I remember reading that book and was intrigued by this whole idea of Zen Buddhism. And I, you know, read a number of books in that sort of genre, if you will, and learning more about Buddhist philosophies and different ways of thinking and just delving into that. But, ultimately, I think the thing about Judaism that I appreciate is this idea that God is within each of us, that there's a spark of divinity in every human being. And there's also some other beliefs about the ability to repair the world, this idea of tikkun olam in Judaism, which is that it's up to all of us to do that. So I think when I think about spirituality and making a difference and practicing no different than many religions, giving and charity in Judaism, they call it tzedakah, which was, the equivalent of like a tithing, but also doing good in the world. And so I grew up volunteering and going on different things. I can remember, whether it's cleaning up a road or a portion of the highway, to going and planting a garden or working on a habitat for humanity, or constructing. I remember building a trail up in the mountains as part of a project where we were putting in timbers and things. But I remember at a very young age being involved in giving back to community. And so that's something that had, I think, a profound effect on who I am today and my view of being able to make a contribution to the world, knowing that, there's something I can do for somebody else, and that everybody has that spark of divinity, no matter the color, religion. And then, of course, when you think about Judaism, you think about the Ten Commandments, of course, and other things like that. So that's, I was brought up around a lot of those principles and precepts. And something, of course, the golden rule, treat others how you want to be treated. And it wasn't until later I learned the platinum rule, treat others how they want to be treated, and understanding the power of that, particularly in business. But I think it's just recognizing that no matter where you are in life and no matter who you're meeting, somebody is, everyone has worth, right? And it's recognizing the worth that's innate to people. And I think that's what part led me to education, because education is drawing that out and is finding the gold, the hidden gems within every human being. So,
oh, getting my eyes all watery on that one. That was awesome.
thank you.
So, being raised in a conservative Judaism household, what made you think, or what made you consider to take this world religion course?
That's a really good question. I don't remember at the time. I think it was probably an easy elective or something.
Okay.
And I was raised, it was Reformed that I was raised. But having said that, I think it's just, I've always been wired to want to know more about the world I live in. And so, to understand more about why people have different beliefs and what's at the root of that, and how that shapes people's identities. It's always been an area I was interested in. I actually did a minor in psychology in my undergrad. So just that the human spirit was something that I was always intrigued by, and what makes people tick. And then I think also, I mean, it was in college, actually. It was in a course. I took a course called Self and Consciousness. That was definitely an elective.
Ooh,
And it
yeah.
was a super cool course. And it was a psychology professor. He obviously, even at the time, I think he was emeritus, but he was like regarded as one of the best professors at the university. And people were like, you got to take his course if you can. And, we delved into just self-awareness and understanding and dreams and all these other things that were really cool. And it was after that course that I decided, wow, it opened my eyes to a lot of different things and different beliefs people had. And it was after that course that I decided to take the world and religion course. But I do remember that aspect of
Okay.
it. So,
Okay. That's
yeah,
awesome.
yeah.
Um, have you, as a member of Judaism,
Hmm.
have you had to deal with any adversity, or any adversity amongst your peers, as far as opening your mind and taking and learning about the other world religions and other world cultures? Was there any backlash or any adversity there?
I don't think about, so much adversity in learning about other religions. I mean, I've been in Mormon temples, I've been in Buddhist, Hare Krishna, like temples and all sorts of different places to, discover the range of, what people believe, mosques and so forth. Um, I think, the backlash, obviously right now, it's ripe in terms of what's going on in Israel and everything else in the world that's going on. And I think even in college, I think I just, there was a part of me that when I thought about like my values, and one of my top values is harmony and peace. And so how that's played out in my life, and then when you look at the conflict that occurs, a lot of the human condition is based on, identities. And if people were really to embrace the principles and values and take those precepts to heart, then would they be treating others the way they are, putting aside ideological differences, right?
Yeah.
To recognize that, people are wired the same. And I had an opportunity, I was at a national leadership conference for a Jewish fraternity earlier this year in another state where I spoke, to hundreds of young, people from hundreds of to plus universities across the US about that. And there is obviously, there's a lot of anti-Semitism right now in the world and a lot of incidents, and you can't go a day without on the news, protests in different college campuses, seeing that. Certainly growing up, there's some stereotypes and some times where you experience that as well. And it is a little alarming. And I state that as actually somebody, I'm a first generation American, with my mom being born over in Europe. And her parents survived the Holocaust. My grandfather was actually in a concentration camp. So when you look at what can happen in terms of, when people do not appreciate and respect life, that we all have that, same divine spark within us. That always is something that is important to recognize, because they say, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And so I think, we can see that playing out over, not just in that situation, but obviously genocide in Rwanda and all these other countries over the years, you name the decade, there's something going on somewhere in the world where unfortunately people do not value human life.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's really unfortunate that there are people out there like that, which is why we have shows like this and other shows out there to remind people how valuable life is and how much we're connected.
Yeah.
So going back to the stereotypes and the conflict, what tools do you use in order to overcome the stereotypes or not get pulled into the drama being stereotyped?
Sure.
And what tools do you use to eliminate the conflict?
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of different things. I think it comes from first being grounded and centered in who you are. And that comes from self-awareness. And I think when you look at the ability to become more self-aware, this may be a sort of roundabout way, but the thing I first thought about is, when you talk about conflict and those stereotypes and things like that, most of the time it's driven out of ego, right? That, you believe like you got to prove yourself, or you got to be better than somebody else. So you're knocking somebody down or you're belittling them based on some attribute or trait that gets associated with a particular race, ethnicity, gender. It doesn't matter what it is.
Right.
But I think, ultimately it's recognizing that aspect of it. And at the same time, sometimes it's out of a scarcity mindset that occurs as well. And certainly we saw that during, Hitler's rise, where it was like, oh, the economic condition is because of, what's going on, because the Jews are all the doctors, the lawyers, and they have all the money and all these other things. So then we don't have it. And you can go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs in terms of thinking about that as it even relates to spirituality. Maybe I'll walk up that ladder, if you will, in his hierarchy of needs. You've got your basic physiological needs, food and shelter and, things to be alive. And then you've got your needs for safety and security and everything. And then I need to belong and self-esteem and then self-actualization. And in fact, most people aren't aware that even Maslow, he didn't publish a lot about it during his life, but he went beyond this idea of self-actualization, which is something that is, about you as an individual, becoming the best version of yourself, living up to your potential, and becoming self-actualized. There's another layer. Any
Yeah.
idea? Did you ever hear about that layer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that layer is self-transcendence, where we
Mm-hmm.
talked about going beyond yourself for the collective good and really having that impact. And I think when you look at that and thinking about like tools for understanding and dealing with conflict, or maybe those other things that occur, it's not just being grounded because you may not have your physiological needs met. Do you ever read a book by Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning, or hear of it?
No. Uh-uh.
Okay. So, and the reason I think it's relevant is because he also, with this idea of sort of self-transcendence, Viktor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor, and he was actually a psychiatrist in Vienna
Okay.
um, before the Holocaust. And he was working on some of his life work, and he had a manuscript that was basically stripped from him along with everything else. But what he talks about in that book, and this relates directly to the question I think you're asking, is that what he said is that everything can be taken from a human being except the last of the human freedoms. And
Yeah.
that's your ability to choose your own attitude, no matter the circumstances. You can be beaten to death or, tortured and, all these um, horrific medical experiments being done on people, whatever the circumstances are. But even
Mm-hmm.
in those circumstances, you could choose your way. And I think in terms of that, he also talks about, and he created this whole field called logotherapy, which is man's or humans' quest for in life is to have some sense of meaning in what
Yeah.
you're doing in the world. And when you lose meaning, you lose hope. And that's where people died, particularly in the camps,
Yeah.
because they didn't have hope for a future and
Right.
they lost touch with that. But the other part of it is that between stimulus and response, being beaten by somebody or whatever, there's a space in that stimulus and response. And in that space is where your freedom lies because you have the ability to choose. You can react, which is what most people do. They have a trigger going
Yep.
to the point,
Yep.
or you can respond and you can take a breath and do that. And so I think for me, it's always been recognizing where people are coming from. And I always assume people have a positive intention as well. And they may not have learned behaviors that are supportive of that, unfortunately, based on the environment they were in. But I think it's the ability to rise above that and recognize that. And also, yes, maybe there is evil in the world and things, but 99.99% of the time, I think people have a good intent. And it's recognizing and drawing that out and having a discussion and understanding where people are coming from. You can learn a lot by listening to
Mm-hmm.
somebody without judging and just pausing before you react and taking the time to respond. So I think for me, it's really emotional intelligence at the end of the day. And when you think about sort of my journey, having been focused on a lot of the academic world for many years, and this focus on IQ, and recognizing that IQ it isn't what's important. It's EQ that's important. It's your emotional intelligence. It's which is intrapersonal understanding yourself and managing and regulating your own emotions. And then it's the interpersonal aspect of that as well, in recognizing other people and managing and influencing them in a way. And so I think I've always been attuned to that. And even thinking back to high school, I was the people that people would come to talk to.
Yeah.
I would listen
Yeah.
and no judgment. I
Yep.
think that's the key. I think in part is being non-judgmental and just meeting people where they're at. And so for me, being centered in who I am and having my own emotional awareness to self-regulate and control, and people are like, oh my God, like examples are abundant. I had a
Yeah.
situation this morning taking somebody to the airport where they forgot their ID, and I was talking to my sister about this, and she's like, I can't believe, like, I would have blown up. I would have been all over. I'm like, but I just, it's like, it happened, so we'll figure it out. Was able to get the person on the plane. Took a
Good.
little finagling, but,
Yeah.
it's not the end of the world, and I
Yeah.
think that's just it. It's like, is it going to matter? those comments or those things, and that people say, is it going to matter an hour from now, a day from now, a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, and 10 years, like in the scheme of things. And I think the other thing is when you look at other people, like the sticks and stones may break my bones, words will never, hurt
You're
me.
right.
Like those types of things on the playground that
Yeah.
yeah, because I had a lot of those words. And it's like, okay, so, but if I lower myself to the level of what people are saying, that means like their opinion of me is more important than my own opinion of me. And I think
Right.
that's where it starts, is with the self-awareness and knowing and being confident in yourself and who you are and what you stand for. So,
Yeah. So, I mean, how do you get there? There's a lot of people that struggle with getting there. So, do you
sure.
have any tips on maybe how you got there, or is it something that you were bred with, or do you have any recommendations for people and like how to
Yeah.
just get centered with yourself?
Yeah. I think it's really, I mean, it's a process, it's a journey. It doesn't happen overnight. Yeah, maybe there's some people that are gifted with that. And depending on what your beliefs are spiritually, maybe there was, a past life or something that you're bringing into this world, who knows, in terms of your personality and, who you are and how you show up. But I think in general, it's a process. And, you can look at all the great religions, and we'll separate religion from spirituality, but the practices that they have about quieting the mind and being able to meditate and really tune into the internal, because we have so much self-talk, right? And I think it's recognizing that self-talk and even the words you use, because all the words you use are, everything we are. And this is something that I only came to later in life, this idea of spirituality. We're all energy, we're all matter, and so we're connected in that way. And I think just recognizing that, it gives you a different perspective, and being able to reflect on that and the connections. Every morning I'm out walking and I do my sort of walking meditation, if you will. But
Okay.
that's my way of being, getting grounded. And so, and
Mhm.
then journaling and doing other things to really tune in and understand, what's going on. And I'll credit actually a fair amount of my introspection. I had a course actually as part of when I was working on my master's degree, in organizational development and change, and all all the surprising places. But one of the things that we had to do as part of that course was talk about a theory we were, you know, talking about in class, or reflect on it. And it was actually probably the first time I ever did a journal per se, but it was like, look at the theory. How did it show up in your life? And what can you learn from it? And, sort of that process. And so for me, that was like, okay, I can learn and see, like, does this work or not? And how does it relate? How does it apply? And how will I use this in some other setting? So give me that opportunity to sort of practice in advance and mentally rehearse as well, being able to do that. And so how do you diffuse situations that would probably trigger somebody, um,
Mhm.
and having those skills? And so I've studied a lot of that and had courses in conflict and mediation and other areas that have given me skills to be able to better manage that, as well as just, I think, again, there's nothing that can replace your ability, I think, to reflect and get to know yourself and who you are. And that's when I do coaching work as well with my clients. It's really helping them understand and figure out their why, right? And then also how that aligns, because and who they are. And I think who they are today isn't as important as who they want to be as their future self. And so I help people really get clear on who they are. And I think if you think about, it's getting a little esoteric, but think about the quantum field and quantum mechanics
Mhm.
and things, like, is that future self already in existence somewhere? And it's
Right.
actually, how do you embrace that? And what does that look like? And declaring, I am this today. I'm not this, that I don't want to be anymore, but really stepping into that. And then if you are that and acting from that place of your future self, how would you show up? What would you need to believe? What would your thoughts be? How would you be behaving and acting, because, and feeling? Because obviously we know that our thoughts determine our words, determine, our feelings and our action, our behaviors and our results. It's that whole chain and cycle. And so when you start connecting those dots, then you can understand sort of the interrelationships.
Yes. So I'm hearing a lot of thinking going on, a lot of processing, right? So a lot of identifying this and identifying that and learning how to define this and who you are. How much of this is, and I say this very carefully because there's a book that I love called Where Buddhism Meets Neuroscientists, or where where neuroscience meets Buddhism. And
Okay.
it's literally a conversation between Western neuroscientists and the Dalai Lama, which
Cool.
is fabulous. It's one of my
Yeah.
favorite books. So how much of it is the brain versus how much of it is the mind and how much of it is the heart?
Wow. That, you know, to quantify that would be really hard. But I do believe that when you think about the mind and what we know about the distinction, that I think it's all stems, if you're asking me personally, my
Yeah.
opinion is it
Your
stems from,
personal opinion for you.
yeah,
Like,
for me, it's the mind, because the mind, there's a universal, we have our mind, but there's a universal mind, is the way I think about it, that we
okay.
can tap into, and that's in the quantum field, in the realm. And when you start thinking about the brain and even the evolution of human beings and the heart, I mean, the idea that we have a heart that beats, and you think about blood pumping through our body, if you want to get into the science behind that, you can go back, a lot of, millions, billions of years to think about the universe and the galaxies and things that are critical to us as human beings, like iron didn't exist until you had galaxies colliding and actually creating iron as a element. And iron is something that's key to our heart. It's in every cell of our blood. There's a
Yep.
thing. And so how that evolved from this universe. And then just when you look at nature and life and fractals and all these other things, it's all interconnected. And I believe, and we know now too, through scientific studies, this idea of the mind, because they can send a photon from thousands of miles apart or whatever, or you have this experience back. I think the Russians were one of the first to do some of these experiments where they, I'm trying to remember if it was, I think it was a bunny rabbit when they did the experiments or whatever, but this was back in the 50s, but they, had a mother separated from her bunnies, like in thousands of miles apart. And actually, in one of the studies, they took them down in a submarine of all the
Wow.
places. And when they actually, intentionally, because they wanted to know, is there a connection here? What's going on?
Yeah.
They actually killed one of the baby bunnies, and the mother would react and know just behaviorally, something would freaking out, the equivalent of that. And then we got like Kenneth Key's the 100 Monkey Syndrome, where things are invented, thousands of miles apart, or a monkey does this on one island and another at the same time. Like there's some mind there, some universal consciousness that's sharing that information, doing like a download, if you will. So our brain, I mean, it's amazing when you think about what it's able to accomplish and the complexity of us as human beings. But I think there's that part of it. And there's a reason, I think, when you look at the heart, it is when you think about thinking and emotion. And I think the emotion is so key to becoming self-actualized, because you can't just be in your head. You've
Yep.
got to embrace your heart and your feelings and understand what's going on and own that. And sometimes you can get a feeling without really knowing what it's about. And I think it's understanding, is that my feeling, or where's that coming from even? Because I do believe that there's, obviously certain people are more susceptible to that than others in terms of empaths and whatnot. But I think, we all are part of this universal mind. So I don't know if that answers that question, but there's a lot of
It does.
different layers to it.
Yeah, for
I'm gonna have to
sure.
read that book now.
I will. You'll have to email it to me so I can look it up later for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
So as an academia, right?
Mhm.
somebody that went to college, best-selling author, right? You taught at a college,
Yeah.
right? Psychology, now you're in the bank system, all of these things. How do you balance your academia with your spiritual beliefs? And where do they blend for you?
Yeah, I think and I guess I draw the distinction between academia, because not all academics, I mean, there's obviously depending on what area they're in, if they're in religious studies or teaching most courses on philosophy, and I took some of those courses too back in the day. But understanding that, I think, is one aspect. And I think, as I think about it, I'm trying to think, someone asked, could a scientist believe in religion? Or spirituality. And they're two different things, clearly. But I think, if you look at the scientific method as an academic, like, can you prove it? Is it a universal truth? And does it exist or not? I think for me, it wasn't until probably 13 years ago, my dad was killed in a car accident. And what was interesting at the time was that, and actually, I had an inclination before that. I guess you could say that this thing about energy or some things that you couldn't explain that occurred, or synchronicities, that there was something else beyond us as human beings. And, really thinking about, what do we know? And can you prove it? To go back to your question about academia and spirituality and how do you reconcile those?
Well,
And I
I mean,
think,
for you, how do you reconcile them?
well, how I reconcile it, and it took me a while to get there, I think, is, are we human beings having a spiritual experience, or are we spiritual beings having a human experience? And I have, in the last decade plus, since some of these things have occurred in my life, really shifted to an awareness that there's a lot of other things beyond what we can see. And we know that in science too. Like Roy G. Biv, we all learned like the colors of a rainbow, and the ultramagnetic, you got all these different wavelengths that travel. And then you can look at what we know in quantum physics about probabilities of, is it a wave or a particle, or is it, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, like it can appear as both depending on the observer and the sort of participant effect as well. So for me, I reconcile it with trusting and knowing that there's more than we can, as human beings, if we are putting on our scientific mind, we don't know, we don't have the information yet about
Yeah.
what exists. So
Okay.
that's all. It's yet to be discovered, really.
Yeah. I mean, they still can't define black matter if it's even matter,
Hmm.
even though they call it black matter, but
Yeah.
they have still yet to be able to identify that it's actual matter, or that
Hmm.
it's even black, or what its function is, or what it does. So if we don't have all the answers. And in
Exactly.
my opinion, if we're only using 10% of our brains,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
how can we how can we possibly know everything, right? Or know about
Exactly.
everything?
Yeah.
So I love that. So in business, because I know in your bio that you sent me, and some of the things that we wanted to talk about was bringing spirituality in as a business leader, or as a servant leader, as a lot of people are calling it these days.
Hmm.
How, I'm not really sure the question here, but um, like, how do you bring that into your business leadership? And how do you coach that with your clients?
Well, I think, again, it starts with a deep understanding of your own strengths, weaknesses, values, motivations, what makes you tick, getting really clear on enhancing your self-awareness. And, ultimately, with self-awareness as a leader, then you can lead with authenticity, with integrity, which are critical when you talk about people following you, right? Building trust within a team. So I think there's that component of it, and I think the other part of it is as I work with leaders in leadership development, is guiding them to make informed decisions, having a strong moral compass of right and wrong. I remember taking a course, I'll go back to the academics since you were asking about that, but sticks with me. I was taking a business law course, and the professor said, you know what? If you want to make sure you're acting with integrity, ask yourself this with whatever you're doing. If what I'm about to do was videotape, and this was before the day of these cell phones and
Right.
devices everywhere, people recording you. But would you be proud if that were to show up on, the news or on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or the Times or whatever? Like, would you be proud of what it is? And I think when you look at that, ethics and decision making, and there's going to be some dilemmas at times, but it's understanding the broader values, and you can get into some of that. I think the other part that I work with people in the coaching is really around empathy and compassion. And you mentioned Bank, which is a system that is really game changing for sales, where I see the clients I work with typically triple conversion rates, going from maybe 20-25% conversion to 75-80%. It was built for sales. But what was interesting, it was built to understand why people make the decisions they do, why they buy something, but why they buy into something. So it's really a tool for influence. And ultimately, when you start understanding that about other people, it's such a powerful tool for empathy, because it's actually at the values basis of other people's decisions. And I think, unlike most other personality tests that are out there that take you an hour to answer dozens of questions, this is super fast. In fact, I've got, let me see if I can find some, there's these four cards. You're basically sorting four cards and saying, like, okay, this is what's important to me. And as you understand your values, again, it's the closest thing next to your identity, because the other traits and behaviors and things like that stem from who you are. That's where going to that future self and operating from that standpoint, if that's your future self and who you are now, and embracing that today rather than 10 years from now, what do I need to value? What do I need to believe? And moving into that, because it gives you the ability to be empathetic, manage emotions, experience of others, enhance your ability to lead diverse teams, have that compassion, and create a supportive environment. And then I think also just, doing that and recognizing, and what's cool about this is the sort order, it gives you an idea of your stress code and how you're showing up, which is really key for a lot of people to recognize. I was doing some training just last week with a couple dozen nurses at a local hospital around using this system for patient care. And what was interesting is, one of the nurses had an aha when we started talking about the sequencing of these cards, and recognized that she's living in stress every day. She leaves her house in one state, and as soon as she gets in the car, it's like, I mean, just her body is under stress. And, when you talk about burnout or resilience and
Yep.
things, it has an impact. And so I think that self-awareness, going back to when I work with leaders, helping them understand that so they can maintain their calm and clarity in the face of challenges, because they're going to be better equipped to adapt, manage stress, change, and they can model that then for their team and inspire their teams with a vision, promoting well-being in the workplace, and sort of setting the tone for what they can do, and and including others, going back to the platinum rule, not the golden rule, but treating others how they want to be treated, and being inclusive to create a state of belonging, which is something Maslow talked about, right?
Yep.
In a safe place. There's a lot of research on, safety and this idea of psychological safety in the workplace from Amy
Oh
Edmondson
my
out,
gosh. Yeah.
things like that. So I think it's really about understanding the intersection between cognitive function and spirituality, that then, get into the deeper, maybe existential aspects of life as a leader. But it's
Yeah.
that self-transcendence. Can you go beyond your individual ability to connect with some greater universal thing, however you think about it?
Yeah. Oh, all good stuff. It's so important that we provide our employees not just a physically safe space, but a psychologically safe space. With
Hmm.
all the workplace shootings and how broad this our culture, our American culture, and our worldly culture are expanding, right? As much as we as a culture, as a human race, has been talking about authenticity and people starting to own their authenticity,
Hmm.
having to be so inclusive in a workspace to where everybody feels psychologically safe. And I think it's great that there's tools like DISC and Bank and a few other things to where it can help you to create compassion to understand, generally speaking, personalities and how people think and why they make the decisions that they make. I wonder how you assimilate those with the 5 love languages.
That's such a great question. Well, so I think in part two, and what's interesting, first of all, I want to share something that if someone takes something away, which they'll take a lot away from this discussion, it's been great, is it's not personal, it's personality. And when you think about that and you think back to some of the conflicts and the other stereotypes and beliefs about human beings and everything else, it transcends, what you're talking about with inclusivity and belonging and things like that. And so when you start recognizing the love languages, in fact, one of my favorite things to train on is this bank system overlaid with the love languages. Because what happens is it's almost that different. Years ago, I read the book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus by
Yeah.
John Gray. It talks about it in terms of gender. But it's almost as if these are different languages. Like this could be English, this persona, if you will, values certain things. That's English, that's French, maybe that's German and Italian. People are speaking different languages. And then within that, it's the same thing with the love languages. Is it time or gifts or, words of appreciation? Like what is it that is going to resonate with that individual person? And I remember I was a manager at UPS, and I had a gala sort of recognition ceremony, and one of my employees recognized him, called him up for an award and everything else. And I'll never forget, Tom, he was pissed. He was actually upset by it later, he told me. And the thought never even crossed my mind that somebody wouldn't appreciate that. But he didn't want that. That was not his love language, far from it. Um,
Okay.
and that was my first, I was practicing the golden rule, right? Like treating
Yeah.
him how I want to be treated. And like I would want that recognition, but he did not. He didn't want that. I mean, it would have been nice to just a quiet pat on the back, didn't want to get up and be embarrassed, his words, in front
Right.
of the group, with that type of recognition. So I think it's recognizing that in the workplace that, yeah, there are love languages in the workplace. And, how can you be respectful and treat people based on what's important to them? And again, it goes back to identity and values and recognizing that there's no right or wrong, it's personal.
Yeah.
It's not personal, it's just personality. And that
Right.
is
Well,
Mac
there's
versus
the
PC. Operating
yeah.
systems are different, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think so. What I'm hearing a lot from you is that it's not just about, there is the essence of it being about ourselves and being self-aware and having our self-ownership, but it's also about being publicly, spiritually aware, right? Being aware of the other person's personality, being aware of the other person's love languages, or, what their values and their morals are, so that you can communicate with them in a healthy way for who you are and for who they are, whether that's in business, in the workplace,
Hmm.
just as a leader, or as a husband and wife, or sister and brother, whatever that looks like. From what I'm hearing, it's not just about you, but it's also about being
Yeah.
universally aware.
Yeah. And I think it's universally, and I think, in the case of another person, it's really emotional intelligence, because emotional intelligence, if you look at the work by, and Daniel Goleman popularized it with his book in 95 on emotional intelligence. But Salovey and Mayer came up with the concept earlier, which still had the same essence of it, but there's the self aspect of it, managing and being aware of your own emotions, and then the interpersonal with other people. And so recognizing other people and being able to influence and interact with them in a positive way. That's what you're talking about, I think, in the workplace. I think when we start talking about spiritual intelligence, then I think it's then, that interconnectedness maybe with them that comes into place to recognize that that everyone I meet is in some way superior to me. I can learn something from everybody. And I think, thinking about that is really important because, and one of the things I'm involved with, and you're aware of this, is Achieve Academy, which is a opportunity within an entrepreneurial organization to help people become thought leaders, to write books, to create courses and develop workshops and training and online courses and bring their greatness to the world. Because ultimately, if you don't, your legacy dies with you. And what can you pass on? And I think for us as human beings, I forget who said it, but this idea of each one reach one, each one teach one. I think of Nelson Mandela and others, this collective wisdom of humanity that then can level up the spiritual intelligence and understanding, the sanctity of life, no matter who that person is. And, being non-judgmental, whether it's that billionaire or whether it's that homeless person on the street, everybody is part of life. And it's not just us as human beings, but animals and nature and plants, and, everything else around us in terms of we're all interconnected.
Yeah. Do you believe that, and I don't ask this in a prodding way, I'm just asking it as an open question. Do you believe that by raising your own spirituality, that you help the overall collective to raise their own spiritual
Yeah.
energy, relationships?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no question about that. And I think that's, when you look at different religions and whoever it is, maybe if it is the philosophy behind it is by self-actualizing and then moving into self-transcendence. And every religion has a different term for self-transcendence, but whether it's Maslow, whether it's Viktor Frankl, I mean, it doesn't matter with Buddhists, enlightenment, this idea. And what you see is that by doing that, we're raising our level of consciousness. And this is where you can get into the quantum mechanics, and we could have some really deep conversations about this.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I mean, everything is vibration. We are all energy and atoms. Like, the fact that like this is not like it looks solid, but it's because there's things moving, matter's moving and vibrating, at very high speeds, right? To create what we perceive as solid matter. But ultimately, I think as we raise our level of consciousness and we know the frequencies of hatred and anger and depression and things like that, and fear, and you can actually measure the different frequencies, and you can look at functional MRIs and things like that and see what's going on in the brain, even let alone measuring the electromagnetic pulses, to understand that love is one of the highest frequencies. And so if we get to the point of having the ability, which we can through our spirituality, to connect and be not only in love with ourselves, but in love with humanity, then absolutely we're going to level up this planet, because it's a frequency, just like the earth has a certain frequency that it resonates on, that will make a difference in the lives of others. And you can think about it, even a smile, like, when someone smiles,
It's
and
contagious.
contagious. And it's the same thing with our thoughts and our words, and saying like,
Yeah.
I'm stupid, or I can't do this, or I can't do that. Like those words are creating a frequency in our brain, and you can start getting into manifestation and law of attraction. But it's true, there's no question about, are you attracting the same frequency? And you will tend to do that. And the only way to change that is by being at a different frequency. And you can do that through self-work and enlightenment, really.
I love that. Okay. So any last tips, tools, messages, anything super juicy that you want to leave the audience with in order to get them to either open their mind or tune into themselves or whatever it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would, two things. I think, first of all, would leave you with this, because I think when you talk about the ego and keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak,
Yeah.
there's certain views of money that I think people don't necessarily recognize, that there's more. Some people do, of course, but money is like, base level. Again, Maslow's hierarchy, like shelter, food, things like that. It provides for things. But the other thing is, and there's a great book called The Good Life that came out of Harvard last year, 85-year study on what constitutes or makes people happy in life. And what they found was about relationships. I think you got money, you got relationships, and you can think about going up even Maslow's hierarchy, but you got knowledge that you can apply. And ultimately you got spirituality, which I think is that part of it. And I think, ultimately, you know, the only two things we're guaranteed in life, again, whether we're spiritual beings having a human experience, whatever you believe,
Yeah.
is that we're in existence, and then at some point in time we're not going to be. And so I would just leave people with the thought of, are you living your why, and are you becoming and answering that question of why you were born? I saw Les Brown speak probably about 8 years ago, I guess, at a conference, and he talked about the wealthiest planet, or the wealthiest place on this planet. And you know what he said it was?
Mm.
We just talked about that recently.
What's that?
It's the graveyard,
The
because the
graveyard.
graveyard is where people's dreams, their hopes, the books that they could have written, the songs that go unsung, the relationships they could have had, all those regrets go to die. And so I would just leave
Wow.
people with that thought about, what is it? What's the song that you have yet to sing? What's the book you want to write? I'd love to help you write it. What's the course you want to create? What's all those
Right.
things that you're meant to contribute? Because again, I think that idea of each one, reach one, teach one, like, how do you pass that along to somebody, and what is your contribution to future generations, and to our planet? So I'd leave people with that thought. I know it's a little deep, but
That is
today was your
deep, but I
last
love it.
day. If today was your last day, would you do what you're about to do? And so I invite you to think about that as well. It's been a pleasure. Such a fun conversation, Wendy. I appreciate you bringing these types of conversations to the world, because we don't have them often enough. I think we're
We
all
don't,
doing
do
our
we?
superficial things day in and day out. So
Well,
it's
and
refreshing.
some people are intimidated or scared, or fear of judgment by bringing up a lot of these conversations, or being free to speak their truth,
Hmm.
right? So um hopefully this show will at least impact one person out there, and help them to find their self-awareness and be able to communicate what their values, what their spirituality, what their religion, whether they're atheists, whatever it is. Like,
Yeah.
speak you, be you, and without fear of judgment.
Yep. Absolutely. And one thing that I think, is helpful, and I'll offer this if it's okay to your listeners or those that are tuned in, you mentioned this bank code report, which again, it's a tool, it's a personality system, and there's a lot of different ones out there, but it does provide you with insights in terms of your strengths. And more importantly, it gives you communication tips you can apply right away. So, and maybe it's something you can post later, but if people want to go to crackmycode.com/communicate, obviously on the internet, https://
Mhm.
crackmycode.com/communicate. You can get a complimentary report and learn more about yourself and have some tips that you can apply. And if anyone's interested in connecting with me to explore a little more, feel free. I'm on LinkedIn, just Eric Goodman, the number 2. You'll find me there as well. So,
I love it. Thank you so much. Thank you
you're
for your
welcome.
bravery and your courage and your open-mindedness to share your story with us today, because it does take courage and self-ownership, self-leadership to be able to speak online about the depths of spirituality,
Right.
right? Whatever
Yeah.
that looks like for you. So thank you so much. I
You're
appreciate it.
welcome.
I hope
Pleasure.
those that are watching, that you got some really great juicy stuff today. You can find us on YouTube. It'll be posted soon.
All right.
Thanks, and tune in a couple of weeks for our next guest.
Thank you.